hop online, the camera will just be up here, so don't worry about if you're back there. We won't let you be. We're not going to show you. So all right. So I'd like to join those of you that are there online. Welcome those of you that join us for Facebook tonight. So tonight we are going to have what we call a Lion's Den, or as a friend of mine here tonight told me so poetically earlier, Stump the Chomp. And so there's a reason why we do this. We normally do it on Sunday nights. Try to do it every 2 months. It's been about 3 months or so since we had the last one, partially because we did that 4-week series on Sunday nights on human sexuality, and won't be able to do it again until the end of August. So it's going to be a while. So I wanted to use tonight to answer any questions that you have and kind of do that. And there's several reasons why we do this. One is I do try to analyze what you ask. If there's, if 10 people all ask similar questions, then it gives me an idea that that's probably something we need to be a little bit more clear on in our church. And so try to address that as we go about and go through things. Also, my biggest hope is that when we answer questions, we answer them biblically, and so we're not just guessing or drawing things. This is my opinion or whatever, and try to help us to differentiate that. And my hope is to model that or teach that so that you do the same on your own. And so, lots of reasons there, and if nothing else, it does keep you humble when you have to go. I don't know, but I'll get back to you. So if you've never been to one of these on a Sunday night, here's how it works. You are free to ask any questions you want about the Bible, about theology, about the church, why we do things the way we do them, or any personal questions about myself that you want to ask. The only thing I will not answer that I ask you not to do is just don't ask me personal questions about other people. And so, don't ask me like, well, what do you think about Andy Glasgow? Or don't ask me personal questions about other people. But other than that, if you want to ask any questions, that would be great. So, with that said, we got one. All right, first one. I'll try. If you'll let me know, I'm gonna try to watch online as well for questions. But if you see one, let me know, and I'll check my phone there for those. All right. So, what's your first one then? Did somebody set you up to that? Because I got asked that question last night at our last Tuesday night Bible study. So yeah. So I just got asked that question last night. So yeah. So if you missed that, it was one of the first ones that were asked. Somebody asked, "Will there be animals in heaven?" So here's my answer. And then I got hit with the more difficult question, which I'll tell you. So my answer is this. I do believe there will be animals in heaven, if you talk about animals in general. And the reason why I believe that is because when you read Revelation 21 and Revelation 21, the description of, we use heaven for shorthand, but the description of the new heavens and the new earth is almost identical to Eden, to the Garden of Eden. And so John draws upon Ezekiel and the vision that he has of a river flowing out of the throne of God and trees bearing their fruit on each side and do that. And so the Bible ends remarkably a lot of the way that it begins. It's a return to the rest of God and in Eden. And so if you remember early on in Genesis chapter 2, God creates all things, and when he creates all things, he presents or has all the animals, all the creatures come before Adam in Genesis chapter 2. And he has him name them all. This is an elephant, this is a giraffe, this is a puppy dog, whatever. That's all before the fall. When you combine that with places like Isaiah, where it talks about a child shall put their hand next to the adder's nest and not be bit, and the lion will lay down with the lamb, and there's going to be peace between prey and predator. It seems to give us the indication that in the new heaven, new earth, there will be animals. The animals will be there. Now, the follow-up question to that is what got me, because the follow-up question to that was, will my dog be there? And so my answer is still the same. I have animals. I have 3 dogs. I have chickens. I love my dogs, but the thing that we have to keep in mind is this. We are fundamentally different from the animals in that we have a spirit, soul. Animals don't have that. They, as much as they maybe mimic and as intelligent as they are, we have a dog right now. It's our plush Dane that I'm trying to train. I'm wanting it to be a therapy dog I can take on visits with me. So if I go to hospitals or things, I can get it to visit. But a lot of work still left to do. It can open doors. It's the only dog we've ever had to do that, but it knows how to open the doorknob and go in. So we have to lock doors to keep the dog out. But as smart as they are not like us. And I think the biggest mistake we make as humans, we tend to be tempted one direction or the other. And so one of the temptations for us is to make ourselves like God. This is the original temptation in the Garden of Eden. The moment you eat of this, you will be like God. And so we elevate ourselves to God-like status. We're not meant to do that. We also go the opposite direction. Instead of elevating ourselves to being like God, we lower ourselves to make ourselves like the beast. And we're not meant to do that either. We're not as low as the beast. As a matter of fact, the psalmist says in Psalm 8, when he's pointing this out, he says, the Lord has made us a little lower than the angels in heaven. He could have said he made us a little higher than the beast. But he doesn't use that language because we're not meant to look down to beasts, to animals, for how we're supposed to be. We're a higher part of creation than they are. So no, your Fluffy won't be there. Or whatever special animal you have. I always give this caveat. I'm not dancing around it, but always because God's God and I'm not. I guess if you want to hope, God is God and he can do whatever he wants to do. So if he wants to recreate Fluffy in heaven, sure, I guess he could do it. But we don't need to confuse categories. Humans are not animals. And we want to make sure we don't confuse those categories that are there. So, good question. Appreciate that. Right off the bat. Yes, ma'am.
What triggered my question is the Asbury revival.
Okay.
Kentucky, and studying the Old Testament, it would seem that when there was great judgment from God, it was preceded by a great falling away in sexual sin, promiscuity.
Okay.
And wondering at the end time, is there going to be what I've always thought? I've been taught that there was going to be a great revival, and I can't really find biblical evidence, especially in the news.
Y'all are just asking all the great questions tonight. So for the benefit of everybody else that didn't hear and those of you online, so the question, if I can maybe summarize it, is coming out of some of the stuff that happened at Asbury, the Asbury revival. If you're unfamiliar with it, big revival, it made it the news for a couple months, and I mean it was huge. People went to Asbury, and more people went to that revival service than lived in that. They had to shut the town down because they couldn't handle the amount of people that went there. And so looking at the Bible, is there going to be you have these sort of ebb and flows of darkness, light. Is there going to be that maybe before Christ returns or at the end times or those things? So, it really depends on your eschatology. And I'm not trying to be squirrely, but I'm not. So it depends on your eschatology. And the reason I say that is because you have very brilliant, very intelligent people that look at these things from an end time, and they come to different conclusions. And so, if you are a post-mill person, even an all-mill to an extent, you're going to see or believe that right up until the end, Satan is either completely bound or he is on a leash to an extent now, so that the gospel goes forth and can change lives. Which is interesting just from a historical perspective, if you go back and look at history, in the 1800s leading up to World War I in the early 1900s, almost every theologian was a post-mill, because you had the Industrial Revolution, you had the invention of the beginnings of modern medicine, and so they were saying, hey, things are getting better, we're getting great. And then World War I comes along, and you have the first use of modern-day machine guns and mustard gas, and you had all these atrocities that it really sort of shifted the theological landscape as people wrestled with the World War. I can't get it out tonight. And that's really where you had the rise of a pre-mill dispensationalism, was between World War I and World War II. And part of what led to that was the Schofield Study Bible. Did y'all have one of those? I know I had one, so a few of you. So it was a King James version, and he put in his notes, and he was a diehard pre-mill dispensationalist. And so a lot of, those people from like 1920 to 2000s were that. And a lot of the Tim LaHaye Left Behind stuff kind of flows in that vein, kind of comes through that. So if you're of that vein, even in that vein, you're going to have different opinions about how dark things get before they come about. What I would say is you do seem to have a few things happen when you get to Romans 9, 10, and 11, and nobody asked me about those chapters. So anyways, when you get to Romans 9, 10, and 11, you certainly seem to have an awakening of Israel. You have Israel turn to the gospel. You certainly have advancements in the gospel. I would even say in the book of Acts, you have tremendous amounts of darkness. So you have, like Paul, I think like Acts 16, Acts 17, Acts 18, and even in chapter 19, Paul gets stoned, whipped, left for dead, brutally attacked, and then people come to Christ. Historically, that has seemed to have been the case, that you have these huge moments of darkness, and then it's like the light of Christ shines the brightest. Now, again, depending on how you read that, depends on your view that you're going to take. You're either going to be more optimistic or pessimistic, or how you take it. However it works out, God's got it worked out, and we trust in Him. And so, I guess my hope would be that the gospel keeps advancing, at least to the point, and maybe we can make the biblical argument for this, to where there is some person from every tribe, tongue, and nation that will be represented before the throne. And the reason we know that is because Revelation tells us that there is someone from every tribe, tongue, and nation. Well, right now in point of history that we know, there's somewhere around 2,600 unreached people groups. So a people group is typically identified as a group of people that they speak the same dialect, the same language, they share a common culture, usually, not always, but usually a similar geography. Well, if you put people in categories of languages and cultures and tribes, there's about 2,600 of those left on the earth that we're aware of, that we know, hey, over there's some people, we can't get to them, we haven't gotten to them, but we know there's people that exist there, and as far as we know, they know nothing of Jesus. And so at least the argument we could make is that before the return of Christ, whether you're pre-mill, post-mill, all-mill, I think we would probably all agree that at some point the gospel is going to make all of those tribes. Now, what happens after that, we might have a little disagreement on. My hope is that, yes, that we do continue to see the gospel advance until Satan's fully let off the leash to deceive the nations. But I may be wrong. Mr. Frank? Yeah. Yeah. So, that's a pretty good question. This is the transfiguration in Matthew 17. So I'm assuming you're talking about the beginning of. Do what? Yeah. So at the beginning of that, you have the transfiguration where Jesus, his glory is revealed. Verse 3, behold, there appeared to them Moses and Elijah talking with them, and Peter said to Jesus, Lord, it is good that we are here. If you wish, I will make 3 tents, one for you, one for Moses, one for Elijah. So Peter, kind of wanting to set up a celebratory monument place for them to stay, so to speak. But he was speaking, and then when he behold, a bright cloud overshadowed them. A voice from the cloud said, "This is my beloved Son, with whom I'm well pleased." So again, we get that voice from heaven. And then verse 9, as they were coming down the mountain, Jesus commanded them, tell no one the vision until the Son of Man is raised from the dead. And the disciples asked him, then why do the scribes say that Elijah must come? And he answered, Elijah does come, he will restore all things. But I tell you that Elijah has already come, and they did not recognize him, but did to him whatever they please. So also the Son of Man will certainly suffer at their hands. Then the disciples understood that he was speaking to them of John the Baptist. So you have all of these prophecies in the Old Testament that before the Messiah comes, there's going to come someone in the spirit of Elijah who is going to make straight the paths for the Lord. They're going to bring down high places. They're going to raise low places. They're in other words, they're going to flatten the playing field. And even to this day, if you were to go to a Jewish Passover Seder, one of the things that they do at a Seder is they leave an empty chair because they're waiting for Elijah to come, and they look and see if he's going to come and be a part of that, because it was expected that he would come and announce the coming of the Messiah. Well, Jesus points in these verses and says, look, that was fulfilled in John the Baptist, that John the Baptist was the prophet in the line like Elijah who came declaring, here comes the kingdom of the Lord, make straight the paths of the Lord, make straight his ways. And so that John the Baptist fulfilled that role and that attitude. But right before that, you have the transfiguration, you have Moses, you have Elijah, you have them affirming those things that come along. So we would say, as Christians, it's already been fulfilled. If you have someone who's Jewish, they would say it's not been. They're still waiting on that. Yeah. Yeah, so he says at the end of Malachi, so it's Malachi chapter 4, he's talking about verse 5. He says, behold, I will send you Elijah the prophet before the great and awesome day of the Lord comes. So this is that prophecy we're just talking about. This is a little bit more. So this is actually in Matthew 4 when it talks about the great day of the Lord. So you have a little bit more of a fulfillment here that takes place. So sometimes prophecy does this with a dual fulfillment. So the great day of the Lord is often referred to as Judgment Day. So when it talks about the great and terrible day of the Lord, so that day when Christ does return. And you do have a similar event happen in Revelation, where you have two witnesses that appear in sort of the same vein. So sort of like the same operation type thing. This is the way that God operates. He sends these there. So when he says about the great and awesome day of the Lord comes, now, again, this is going to depend on your eschatology. Some people would say, yeah, this is already fulfilled. This was fulfilled in John the Baptist is done. Others are going to say this is going to be fulfilled in the witnesses that come in Revelation. And you can talk to 5 other theologians and probably get 5 different answers. But that's what he's referring to. So he will turn the hearts of fathers to their children, the hearts of children to their fathers, lest I come and strike the land with a decree of utter destruction. And so the term there is talking about being set apart and what he's going to do during that time. Jesus will even hint on this in the Gospels when he gets to Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. he'll say things similar about sort of the opposite vein. Um, if anyone does not hate their father or mother, they're not worthy of coming. If anyone does not hate their children, when he's mentioning that, it's not as though, all right, I got to go out and hate my parents, because that would be contrary to everything else that he's commanded, to love your neighbor, to honor your mother and father. But he's making a comparison that, in comparison to your love for me, it ought to look like it ought to look like hate, because you love me so much more, that your devotion is to me, not to them. And sometimes we even see that in certain cases where, as strange as it may sound in our culture context, but there are certain cases where people will, because of their allegiance to their parents, they won't come to Christ, or they won't follow Christ. And particularly in that shame and honor culture, that's a big deal. I remember, I think I shared this story with you before, but I was in West Africa in a predominantly Muslim area. And we had this huge guy. He was the biggest guy I've ever seen in Africa. I mean, he's like 6'7", 300 pounds. Very unusual. He's a very big, burly guy. His name was Baba. And he came to Christ. And normally what we do when someone comes to Christ, we're rejoicing, clapping, amen, hallelujah, praise the Lord. He's walking away crying, I mean, in tears. And I remember asking the career missionary that was there, I was like, what's the deal? He just, he's, I understand maybe guilt and all that. And they're like, no, he lives with his family. Like, they live in a compound, and he's going home to tell them that he's a Christian now, and they're going to beat him and throw him out of the house. And so when Jesus uses some of that cultural analogy about hate mother and father, he's using that like, look, sometimes you may have to do away with that. Well, Malachi is using kind of that same type of language when he's talking about this, and he reminds them, particularly just before this in chapter 3, about the book of remembrance and giving obedience to the Lord and doing those things. So he's using that same analogical language and talking about what should happen at the day of the Lord is returning to the way of your fathers, returning to the way of God, essentially. He's using the analogical language to describe that. In a similar way, Jesus does the opposite in the Gospels, but same type of language, if that makes sense. I hope that does. All right.
In reference to the Elijah mentioned right there, in chapter 1 of the book of Luke, Gabriel comes to Zechariah, the priest, while he's in the temple serving, and gives him a vision of coming of John the Baptist.
Right.
And he makes this statement in verse 17, and it is he who will go as a forerunner before him, that's Christ, in the spirit and power of Elijah, to turn the hearts of the fathers back to the children, and the disobedient to the attitude of the righteousness, so as to make ready a people prepared for the Lord.
Yeah, so all those prophecies together.
That's referencing back to Malachi 3:1.
Right.
About that forerunner.
Yeah, Malachi, 4:1, yeah.
Well, no, 3:1.
Well, yeah, so yes, 3:1, and then the end of chapter 4.
Two of
Yeah.
those in Malachi, 1 and 3,
Right.
5 and 6.
Right.
But John the Baptist, boy, did come in the power of the Spirit.
Yes.
Elijah.
Yeah. So that's a fulfillment of multiple Old Testament prophecies, and they're all the same. He's going to bring the mountains low. He's going to bring the roads up. He's going to level the playground. He's going to prepare, like a trumpeter, prepare the way of the Lord in the same spirit of Elijah. And it may make more sense if you remember Elijah's story. By the way, it's on YouTube if you ever get a chance to listen to it. I think he preached it here one time, is from what I've been told, and maybe the old church in Old Town. But there's a guy named R.G. Lee that had a famous sermon called Payday Someday. If you've never heard it, it's on YouTube. It's worth the listen to. But he preaches about Elijah, and he talks like this. He says, and Ahab flung her down. It's just the way he preached. But if you don't remember Elijah, his story, essentially, he lived during a time of incredible wickedness. You had Jezebel, who was married to Ahab, and they did all kinds of wicked things, which led up to that confrontation at Mount Carmel in the book of Kings, in 1 Kings 19. And so, if you don't remember the story, they build altars. The prophets of Baal build an altar to Baal. Elijah has an altar to God and douses it in water. And let's see who can call down fire from heaven. Well, the prophets of Baal, they do it all day long. They chant, they cut themselves, they beat themselves. And Elijah sits there and mocks them and is like, well, maybe Baal's sleeping. Maybe, and I'm not making this up. This is what he says. Maybe he's in the bathroom and he doesn't hear you. It's like, maybe he's out doing those things. And so Elijah's story is about a prophet that was coming at a time of darkness, pointing people back to the Lord. Well, so when they pick up on that and says there's one that's coming in the spirit of Elijah, that's what they're saying. There's one that's going to come pointing you back to the Lord and preparing you for his kingdom. Well, that was John the Baptist who did that, pointing to Christ. So sometimes it helps to remember the story, the time period that went there. Elijah is one of my favorite stories. I love his stuff, because after that Mount Carmel, he has a pity party and runs away and goes in a cave, and God's like, it's all right, take a nap, have some cake, and I love that. It's like God just shows up to him and says, just take a little nap, eat a little cake. I'm like, Lord, I'll take that advice any day. So, but anyways, yeah. Like Elijah himself. I mean, he certainly could. So the question asked is, if Jesus came twice, could Elijah come twice? Certainly he fulfills part of that there at the Transfiguration when Elijah and Moses are there. He certainly could come later on if you have that. I would just be careful. I want to see, prophecy can have dual fulfillment. In other words, it can be, partially fulfilled here and then fully fulfilled later. But there's so much there about John the Baptist that I would not want to negate that, if that makes sense. Like I wouldn't want to throw John the Baptist in the trash, and and as long as I was maintaining that, then you could probably look at maybe the witnesses or others later and say there's another possibility there. Yeah. Right. And after, yeah. So, as long as you're not, that makes sense. Yeah. Right, yeah. Yes, ma'am. Ms. Liz. I am. It has been a while since I've read it, but I've read it a couple of times, but I think the last time I read it was about 10 years ago. So. It is. I think Katie read it recently. The Book of Heaven, didn't you read that recently? I thought that was on your nightstand maybe a year or two ago. Randy Alcorn. Yeah. So, she was reading it, and I would. It's a good book. It's a generally good. It's much better than a lot of other works I've run across. So, yes, ma'am, I would. Right. Yeah. I mean, there were a few things. Like I said, it's been 10 years since I've read it, but I remember it generally being good, and I think it was a year or two ago you read it, because I remember it being on your nightstand, and but generally, yes, ma'am. Yeah. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, so I mean, it is interesting the way that God creates things, and part of me, part of the things I believe is that when God creates things, He creates things with an intention, with a purpose. Now, some of those intended purposes have been distorted by sin, and we don't always see how they're there. But one of those things I think that we see is light and darkness. I think that was intentional. I mean, if you really think about it, God could have made us like bats, right? I mean, he could have just given us all sonar, and he's free to do whatever he wants to do. But he gave us these occipital lobes that can see light, and we call them eyeballs, that can see light and darkness. And so, when you get into the Word, you have a very distinct line drawn. You either belong to the kingdom of darkness or you belong to the kingdom of light. Well, one of the ways we know what that is I think kind of intuitively, even as children, we're afraid of the dark. We're afraid of the dark because we can't see what's there, and we kind of stumble and bumble around and do whatever. Well, when there is total darkness, you feel it. You know it. And so I remember the closest I ever got to this was, I don't know if y'all remember a few years ago, there were a bunch of miners in South America that got caught in a mine down below, and they kept saying on the news, there's only one mine in the U.S. that's as deep as that mine. Well, that one mine was owned by one of our church members in Virginia, and I got to go down in it one time with them. And we went down, and it took us about 2 hours on this little electric car to get to the face wall, the wall of that they were mining. And we were coming back by, and they were telling me about how dark it was when you didn't have any lights on. They said, within like 48 hours, it's so dark that if you were to stay down there, you would go blind. Like you would start to lose your eyesight. That's how dark it is. And so I said, hey, can I experience that? And they're like, sure. So they turned everything off. We turned all the helmet lights off, turned everything off. And I tell you could feel it. I mean, it was like a crushing. And I'm not claustrophobic, but I mean, you could feel the darkness. And so I think what they're describing there in Exodus 10 is that it was so supernatural dark. It wasn't just like it was cloudy, or it wasn't like an eclipse. If you've ever seen an eclipse, there's still some light. This is a supernatural plague, and it was so significant. That's how dark it was. And so they felt that just on them. Now, will hell be that way? So, in one sense, yes, and this is one of the anomalies, and there are some anomalies about hell when you get in the New Testament. It's referred to as the kingdom of darkness, and so there's going to be darkness. And so here's what's always been interesting, is you have it a place where the worm never dies, and the flame is never quenched. And so how can you have flames and have darkness? But here's, just again, one of the cool things about creation, a lot of people don't realize, is the hotter a flame gets, the more invisible it is. Do you realize that? So, if you have like a red flame, it's kind of cool. You get it hotter, it becomes blue. You get it really hot, it becomes white. You get it really, really hot, you can't even see it. And so, it could be that it's so intense, it's so hot that it is a burning darkness. And again, another one of the anomalies about hell is, so I believe that God is omniscient, omnipresent, meaning that there is nowhere that God is not. And that includes hell. I think God is even the God over hell. He's the king of hell in that sense. Not in the sense that Satan is, but he's the king of all things. But in some real way, he removes his presence or withholds his grace from those that are in hell. And that's what makes hell hell. The flames are bad, the worms are bad, the torture's bad, but what makes it really bad is nothing of the grace of God there. And even here, you can have the deepest, darkest, most wicked person that there is on this planet, and they still know something of the common grace of God. And so the common grace of God, we think of things like the Lord sends rain upon the righteous and the unrighteous. So when it rains, we had that storm last night came through. It rained on my house, believer in Jesus Christ, and it rained on my neighbor's house who's an atheist. We both got rain because we both experienced the common grace of God. And there's a lot of things like that are here that even the darkest person still gets the common grace of God here. But that won't be the case in hell. I think that's probably one of the illusions when you get to the parable of Lazarus and the rich man. If you remember, the rich man asked, he says, can you just give me a little drop on my tongue? I think that's one of the illusions there. It's not just that it's so hot, it's that there is no common grace there. There's no rain upon the unjust there. And let me have just a little bit of grace. So yeah, I mean, it could be some allusions to that. It's a good question, Mr. Bailey.
I work for a utility company up in Ohio. People don't realize generators, these big generators, are running in a hydrogen atmosphere
Right.
to cut down resistance. Well, the problem with that is you can get a hydrogen leak. If it gets out where it can ignite, if it isn't burning something else, you can walk into an invisible flame.
Right.
Because you will not see the hydrogen flame. And all you'll see is a heat wave.
Right. That's it. Yeah. Yeah.
And so that was one of the things, you always thought as you're walking under these generators, checking them, that, be careful, be aware of what you're walking into.
Yeah.
You could walk into your death.
Yeah. Anybody that has a butane lighter, you've probably experienced that before. If you've got a butane torch or lighter, you can't see the flame, and a lot of times you can't see it because it's so hot. You can't see it. So that's it. So you see it, smell it, yeah, and so that way you have a leak, But, yeah, good questions. Anybody else? Go ahead. All right, yeah, go ahead. Yeah, the Midrash. I got a copy on my desk right now, actually. Okay. Is there any yeah. No, I mean, I would have to go back. So if you're not, so a midrash is simply, it's similar to what we would call a commentary. It's it's a group of teachings that have been put together on that, and midrash, midrash, and you can buy it in a multi-volume or a single, So like I would any other resource. So if I'm looking at some resources, I would put my authority is Scripture, and I'm going to kind of put everything else down here and there. So the midrash is interesting to go look and see it how they would have interpreted some things at their time, but then you also have to realize that they were notorious for expounding volumes of material where they probably shouldn't have, and one of the particularly in the post-exile. So when Israel came out of exile from Babylon, they were in Babylon for 70 years. They went into exile because of idolatry, and when they came out of exile, they learned their lesson so well that they were like, "We're never going to do that again." And what they ended up doing is that's when they ended up adding all those things to the law to try to prevent them from doing that, going back in exile. And so you get volumes of stuff that are added to that. So yeah, I mean, it's like I said, literally my copy's on my desk right now. I had it out. I was looking at something not long ago, and as an interesting resource, a good resource, look at it. Give you some maybe cultural insight, but I would take it with a grain of salt. So. Yeah, so a lot of what they do is they'll take biblical stories and kind of add either the oral tradition behind it or the legend behind it. So you do have in Exodus 17 is where Moses draws water from the rock. So this is there. And if you remember, he struck the rock. He wasn't supposed to strike it. And he strikes it, and he gets in trouble. And so what that may be, I would have to go look at the specific in the Midrash. But what I would guess is they're taking Exodus 17 and kind of either adding an oral tradition to it or maybe some of the legend behind it is probably.
It's a Hebrew Bible made relevant to the needs of a specific period of time.
Yeah, and that's what it was. It was essentially, depending on what time period you're looking at, but it was largely the writings of rabbis that were, again, like what we call a commentary. So if you pull a commentary from my office, it's going to have the biblical text, and then it's going to have whatever that person says about that biblical text right next to it. The Midrash is real similar, and it's going to draw a lot of those things into it. So plus a lot more things. Yes, and that's another good point. So there's another volume called the Talmud, and and you actually have two sets of that, which is, so if the Midrash is like this, the Talmud is, that. I mean, and so you have a Babylonian Talmud, which is exile after, and then you have a pre-exile volume. And pretty much all those things are divided by they're either divided by the United Kingdom and the divided kingdom. So the United Kingdom would be when David and Solomon ruled, and then the divided kingdom would be when Rehoboam split the nation, or they go around the exile when they went into Babylon or before or after Babylon, essentially. Yeah. And that's a good way to remember the Old Testament, by the way. If you're reading the Old Testament and you're trying to figure out where you are, the two questions you can ask is this: where is this related to the exile? Is this before the exile, or is this after the exile? And the other good question to ask is, where is this related in the kingdoms? Is this when it's one kingdom, so it's all 12 tribes are together, or is it a divided kingdom? And usually the prophets will tell you the very first couple verses of the book. It'll tell you these are written to the tribes of Israel, or these are written to the tribes of Judah, and it'll tell you if it's been divided or not. Usually. Not always, but usually. Miss Liz? Yeah, I do. So if you heard the question about study Bibles and recommending study Bibles, the ones that I would stay away from, and I'll probably get strung up for saying this, but the ones that I would stay away from are the ones that are written by one person. And so there may be some great people out there that you love as a preacher or something like that. But the problem is that preacher cannot be an expert in everything. So the best study Bibles are where you have multiple authors, and you have, the guy who's an expert in Ephesians, he wrote the study portion on Ephesians. And the guy who's an expert on Psalms wrote the part on Psalms. So a great example, and this is where like John MacArthur. Lots of people love John MacArthur. Does he have good preaching? For the most part, yeah, I think so. But his commentaries, as intelligent as he is, I would rather have a commentary set that is written by multiple people instead of just one person. So same thing with study Bibles. You have like the John MacArthur Study Bible or the Tony Evans Study Bible, or they're just that one person. They're just not going to be as rich as study Bibles that are written by multiple people. So the ones that are written by multiple people they're not going to be after a famous preacher or something. They're going to be based on the translations. And so there's great ones, and there's even some that are categorically specific that are good ones. So one of the ones I love personally, there's an archaeological study Bible, and it has, you're reading like in Daniel about the handwriting on the wall, and on the very next page is a picture of things that they've dug up in Babylon, and it's got all the history. So I love that one. But there's some other great ones like the NASB Study Bible that's just based on the translation, not on one individual. And so those are going to be more of, there's a whole group of people that write them. So, but please hear me. I'm not knocking any of those individuals I mentioned. I'm just when you have more people writing together, you just get more depth. So, yeah. So we do. Yeah, so we do. We have quite a few Bibles in the large conference room that we give out, and then we have Bibles. We all keep Bibles in our offices that we give out as well, and we'll be like a translation or something. Yeah. So if it's a brand new believer, like someone that has no religious background whatsoever, I do recommend one of the more modern translations. So, I preach from the ESV. I think it's still pretty easy to understand for most people. It's a great translation. Um, now you got to hear me on this one. The old NIV that has a copyright of 1984 is a good translation. Yeah, the New International Version has a 1984 copyright. The new NIV, stay away from it. So it has a 2000 or later copyright on the NIV, stay away from it. The NASB, the New American Standard, and even one of my favorite ones, if I have a real new believer, one of my new favorite ones is the Christian Standard Bible. They did a great job, just real easy to understand, straightforward. Right. Yeah, particularly so if you have somebody like that that's coming from there, if they have one of the things I found, if you have somebody that's coming out of Jehovah's Witness or Mormons, if they're coming out of that, they tend to respect the King James Bible. And so what you can do is get a new King James Bible, which is a little bit easier to understand, and sometimes they'll have more respect for it than maybe something else, just because of the things that they came out of. So sometimes that helps. Okay. Well, I think that's it. That's time. I'm getting washed on time. Love you guys. Praying for you, and we'll see you around. Y'all have a great evening. God bless. Thank y'all. The what?